Townsend, and I'm the director of the Levin Center at Wayne State University Law School. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's panel discussion entitled Congressional Investigations, Making History and Shaping Our Understanding of the American Story. Today's panel discussion will formally launch a new Levin Center program called Portraits in Oversight. It's a series of profiles about historically significant congressional investigations and the members of Congress who led them. The portraits explore congressional oversight from 1792 to the present, including inquiries into the Civil War, covert CIA operations, Enron and Watergate, and such figures as Representatives John Dingell and Elijah Cummings, and Senators Harry Truman and Joe McCarthy. All portraits can be viewed online or can be downloaded, and they are free to use with acknowledgement. You can find all 14 of the portraits on the Levin Center's website, levin-center.org. And you can return to the site to see new additions to the portrait gallery as they come online in the future. I want to thank the Levin Center staff for exceptional work in researching and producing these portraits. In particular, research assistant Kyle Gettert, Washington office co-director Elise Bean, and program manager Margot Lapere. They did a fantastic job. I also want to thank the community of oversight academics and practitioners who reviewed, fact-checked, and offered editorial suggestions. The portraits you see would not have been possible without their help. Now I'd like to say a word about the Levin Center. The Levin Center's mission is to promote and teach bipartisan, fact-based oversight and civil discourse as instruments of change. Since 2015, when the late Senator Carl Levin established the center here at Wayne State University Law School, we have pursued that mission through trainings and workshops in Congress and state legislatures, convenings, commentary in the media and in the courts, and through research and scholarship. In fact, the center right now is seeking applicants for our Levin Center Oversight Fellows Program to encourage scholarly research on oversight. To date, the scholars we have supported have tended to be in the fields of law and political science, but I want to especially encourage historians participating in our panel today, as well as watching online, to apply. For more information about the program, you can find it at the center's website, and we have posted the page's URL in the chat. But all of this really starts with helping people understand what oversight is and its role in our system of self-governance, the ways in which legislative investigations, hearings, and reports influence what we as a people decide is true. Our goal in producing these portraits is to leverage the incredible history of congressional oversight in this country to shed light on what is oversight. When has oversight been done well? When have members of Congress misused the power of oversight? When have they failed to do the necessary oversight? And what have been the consequences for our nation? Have the facts uncovered by oversight changed our country at a time, either at the time when they were being uncovered or maybe later on? I mean, ultimately, we're asking, do the facts win out? To launch this program, we bring you today's panel discussion with a group of distinguished historians of Congress who will guide us as we begin this journey into the history of congressional oversight. Before turning things over to our moderator, who will introduce the panel, I want to thank the U.S. Capitol Historical Society for co-sponsoring this event, and I'd like to ask its president and CEO, Jane Campbell, to say a few words. Jane?
Well, thank you, Jim, and thank you to everyone at the Levin Center for this remarkable work. I've had an opportunity to look at all of the portraits in oversight, and they certainly tell an amazing story, from going back to 1792, when the first congressional oversight conversation went on about General St. Clair's defeat. And, you know, sometimes they say, what is Congress doing with all this oversight? Here was a conversation that had Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, Edmund Jennings Randolph, who were all executive branch folks. Washington was the president. The Constitution was silent about oversight. And those executives determined that, in fact, yes, Congress did have the power. They had the power and the responsibility to deal with oversight because they were responsible about how the nation's money was spent. And that oversight inquiry came about with a number of changes. And if you take a look, that setup established some of the oversight principles that we have today as we're talking about what is executive privilege. You can go back to that discussion. So the fact that the Levin Center has brought this to light is a wonderful thing, and the United States Capitol Historical Society is honored to co-sponsor it. We have the privilege, we're about to celebrate our 60th year as the congressionally chartered nonprofit to tell the story of the Capitol and the people who work in it in a manner to inspire informed patriotism. That's what it said in our authorizing legislation. And we think congressional oversight is certainly part of that. I had the honor when I was working with the United States Senate to see Senator Levin in action in his oversight activity. I was first Senator Landrieu's chief of staff and then the staff director for the Committee on Small Business, which he was on. And one of the oversight things that we did is every year we reviewed how well were the departments meeting their small business goals. And we always wanted to make sure that Senator Levin could come to that particular meeting because he had an extraordinary way of asking the very most direct questions. And the way that was done is departments were given an A all the way through an F about how close they got to their goals. And we invited the people who had an A and the people who had an F to come and be our panel. And you can imagine, we asked the A people, what did they do that made it possible? And we asked the F people, what were they going to do to make it right? And so I am confident that Senator Levin is just smiling and saying, go forth, this is what we need to do. So let the panel begin.
Dan, thank you for those kind remarks. Now let me introduce our moderator for today's panel. Elise Bean is co-director of the Levin Center's Washington office and was instrumental in the establishment of the Levin Center. Prior to joining the Levin Center, Elise served for 30 years as a congressional investigator on Senator Levin's staff, where she became staff director and chief counsel of the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations and led some of the most important congressional inquiries of the past 2 decades. Elise, in 2018, published a book called Financial Exposure, which recounts a number of those investigations. So please welcome my colleague and our moderator today, Elise Bean. Elise? Please unmute.
Mute. Okay, classic. So thank you so much for those kind remarks. And I also want to say thank you to Kyle and Margot for all the hard work they put into getting these portraits ready for us today. It's really been a wonderful experience. It is also my pleasure to announce our distinguished panel of scholars to discuss the portraits and oversight and how congressional oversight investigations have affected the American story. So Norm Ornstein is a senior fellow emeritus at the American Enterprise Institute, and he's a leading scholar on Congress, politics, and elections for more than 4 decades. Over his career, he has also worked to advance political reforms, particularly campaign finance and election reforms, as well as reforms in the House and Senate. His books include It's Even Worse Than It Looks: How the American Constitutional System Collided with the New Politics of Extremism, and The Broken Branch: How Congress is Failing America and How to Get It Back on Track. Kate Scott is an associate historian at the U.S. Senate Historical Office. She also teaches at Cornell University's campus here in Washington. Her specialties are congressional oversight and investigations, executive legislative relations, women in politics, and U.S. foreign policy. She is the author of Reigning in the State, Civil Society and Congress in the Vietnam and Watergate Eras. Most importantly, the Levin Center would like to thank her for her encouragement and support in developing the portraits that are available today. Professor George Derrick Musgrove is an associate professor of history at the University of Maryland in Baltimore County. He teaches courses in post-World War II U.S. history with an emphasis on African American politics. He is the author of Rumor, Repression, and Racial Politics: How the Harassment of Black Elected Officials Shaped Post-Civil Rights America. He also co-authored Chocolate City, A History of Race and Democracy in the Nation's Capital. And finally is our own Professor Liette Gidlow, who is a professor of history at Wayne State University in Detroit. She's also a fellow at the Harvard Radcliffe Institute. Before joining the academic world, she worked as a legislative staffer in the US Congress. She researches and writes about US politics since the Civil War and is the author of 2 books, The Big Vote and Obama, Clinton, Palin. And in fact, we found out that most of our panelists today have worked on the Hill, and that's a wonderful thing for that additional perspective. Okay, so let's get going. We're delighted that you can join us today, and for our viewers, I invite you to submit any questions you may have to our Q&A function on your screen. We'll review them as the discussion continues, and also we have a link to the portraits themselves in the chat and invite you to take a look. Okay. Let's begin with our questions. You have all had a chance to look through the portraits in Oversight, and I'd like to start by giving each of you 2 minutes to convey what you think these portraits say about the importance of congressional oversight and what it means to our body politic and constitutional form of government. We're going to do sort of a lightning round to let the viewers know what you think of the portraits as a whole. So let's start with Norm. Love to hear your impressions.
Thanks, Elise, and thank you all for doing this and for all the remarkable work that the Levin Center is doing. One thing that I learned from these portraits, and they're just a terrific and beautifully written look at the history of oversight, but there are different kinds of oversight. There's the oversight of scandals or crises in and out of government. And we have those going back to the beginning with the St. Clair investigation, as Jane suggested, all the way up to the current day. We have outside ones that include the Ku Klux Klan and the havoc that it wreaked, murder and intimidation otherwise in the aftermath of the Civil War. We'll come back to that one, I think, because it actually has some parallels with what we see with the January 6th Commission. And then there are other outside problems like the financial collapse in after 2008, the savings and loan one as well. And then there's a second category, which we see a lot of with what Carl did, which is the routine oversight, something we hope would happen more often, which is Congress looking at the operations of agencies and programs, seeing if they work as Congress intended. A lot of that used to be done through the appropriations process. A couple of points that I would add just more generally. What you see infused through all of this is oversight works when we have the commitment to institutions. Decades ago, around 1960, the late political scientist Donald R. Matthews wrote a book about the Senate called U.S. Senators and Their World, and wrote about folkways. And it's the norms that undergird, that are the kind of exoskeleton for the entire process of governance. And one he called institutional patriotism. If you believe that your institution is important and it needs to be handing out or handling inquests for the country as a whole and protecting the prerogatives of Congress, but also making sure the system works, that's institutional patriotism. It is in short supply these days. And of course, what we also see through many of these investigations is both parties working together. with a Herculean effort in many instances to make them work. That's what we saw with Tom Coburn and Carl Levin, two people who could not have been more different in their worldviews, but who found ways to work together because they saw common problems. What do we do now with the challenges where we don't have a set of common problems, where tribalism takes over, where the desire to protect your own party or your own president takes precedence over looking to make sure that you can right wrongs or look through and find wrongdoing and hold it to account? So that's my initial set of observations, Elise.
Thank you so much. Kate, let's hear from you.
Yes, hi, thank you. I would like to start just by applauding the Levin Center for taking this historical approach to congressional oversight and investigation. As a historian, it warms my heart. I love it. Since its earliest years, Congress has exercised its power of inquiry. That's what these portraits demonstrate for us, in order to conduct oversight, importantly, to inform the public, and also, of course, to write good legislation. Over the course of its history, Congress has conducted hundreds of these investigations, a dozen or so, which the Levin Center portraits highlight. But these investigations, of course, have been broad. Not only has Congress investigated the executive and judicial branches, but also it has looked into business practices, organized crime, civil liberties, and even baseball. I think that these Levin Center portraits demonstrate that beginning with that first congressional investigation in 1792, Congress has assumed an inherent authority to make sure that laws are faithfully executed by the executive branch. And also the Constitution grants Congress, of course, the power of the purse, as Jane mentioned. So Congress has a responsibility, a constitutional responsibility, to ensure that the money that it appropriates is spent as Congress intended it to be. I think these portraits do a fabulous job of demonstrating that exercising this assumed explicit and implicit authority has been a historically contingent process. And I really look forward to sort of teasing out some of those threads today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Derek.
Well, thank you. And thanks especially to the United States Capitol Historical Society and the Levin Center. So I'm just going to make 2 points here. And I think the first one is to say that, oversight at its best, and this is really what the portraits allow us to see, is a positive. In fact, it's a necessary element of a functioning democracy. But as I was leafing through the Washington Post yesterday, I was reminded by the editorialist Paul Waldman, the following, and he says this. He says, look, as necessary and important as congressional oversight is, it's only as good as the people elected to Congress, which includes the wise and the foolish, the serious and buffoons. And what I love about the Levin Center collection is that it doesn't shy away from the manner in which Congress has performed oversight over the years. There have been statesmen and wise legislators who have done excellent oversight investigations that have led to very important legislation that structures our lives down to today. And then there have been people who have abused that authority. And you can, of course, see this in the McCarthy hearings from the 1950s. And you see both of those things in here, the potential for bad actors, and in fact, the potential and the reality of folks who have done their due diligence and made ours a better republic in the process. Now, as a citizen and a historian, I should point out that when I look at oversight investigations, I'm really interested in two things. The first one I kind of share with all of my fellow Americans, right, which is that oversight investigations should tell the citizenry what's going on with an important issue and potentially point our way towards corrective legislation. And a lot of the sort of portraits of good oversight that the Levin Center has put together, I think show us how that is done. And then the other thing that I look for when I look at oversight investigations as a historian specifically is that, oversight investigations should be able to amass a huge amount of information that, quite frankly, few other institutions are capable of gathering. You think about Congress with its subpoena power, but also with its large investigative budget, can simply get information that other bodies cannot. And so what I love about some of these investigations is that what you also see is this huge trove of information that is collected by Congress really at a time when other people cannot get it, and then put down in the historical record for people like myself to go over in the years later. And the last thing I'll say is that oversight investigations, sort of secondarily for the historian, show us the dramatic divisions within Congress. And so you can typically see that through a majority and a minority report, but you can also see it through the questioning of witnesses, depending on which member of Congress is going after them.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to hear a historian's viewpoint on the oversight investigations. Liette.
Right. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for the work of the Levin Center in highlighting these portraits of times when congressional oversight has functioned at its best and times when it has not functioned as effectively as the historical moment required. To me, these portraits demonstrate that congressional oversight is an essential function in a government that is structured around separation of powers, that it is essential that Congress have an eye on administrative structures in the executive branch, and that it be likewise involved in overseeing ways that the judiciary operates as well. And the effective functioning of a government characterized by separation of powers cannot go forward without important examples of congressional oversight. In looking at these many portraits, I am struck by how remarkable it is that congressional oversight works as often as it does, because there are so many factors making it an extremely difficult undertaking. Partisanship can interfere with effective oversight. Distrust of various members, personal distrust and enmity can interfere with effective investigations. Lobbying can interfere with effective investigations. And so I think it's important for us to recognize that there are institutional as well as personal characteristics, characteristics of the institution and characteristics of individuals involved in these oversight investigations that are both necessary to effective investigations. Sometimes these investigations show us portraits in courage, in which people reach out across partisan lines, put aside personal ambitions, and occasionally, at their worst, portraits show really a portrait of cowardice as well. And at those times, our nation has been poorly served. So it's an important undertaking, and I applaud the center's efforts to help us understand it better and take the long historical view.
Well, thank you so much. It's so interesting to me to hear these variety of perspectives. The US legislature, the Congress, is almost the only one in the world that really does this in-depth type of investigation. And I really think it's been a gift to the world to show what elected leaders can do. So we've talked about the portraits in general. I'd like to ask each of you to pick out maybe one portrait that is your favorite. And if you could tell us a little bit about that portrait and why it's your favorite. And let's start again with Norm.
So I alluded to this a bit in the initial remarks. I think my favorite actually is the investigation in the aftermath of the Civil War of the Ku Klux Klan. We know that the Klan, which was basically started by Confederate soldiers trying to keep the newly freed slaves and the African-American population from voting, but also intimidating and sometimes murdering Republicans who wanted to move beyond the Civil War and unite the country, and did horrific things. And Congress went to investigate There were Democrats and Republicans on the investigative panel. The Democrats, of course, in some ways tried to, and I'll use the term directly, whitewash what was going on and make excuses to a degree. They also found some ways to work together. And while it was, as we know, far from perfect, we still have a Klan today, they were able to put a public spotlight on a horrific set of circumstances and at least make some changes that ameliorated the problems. I would add just one other thing. My second favorite is simply John Dingell. And it's a portrait of Dingell as a person and all of the work that he did. I was close to John, went to visit him in Dearborn not long before he died. But I just want to tell one little story, which is in the 1970s, Tom Mann and I issued a report recommending changes in the committee system in the House that included moving some jurisdictions around, some away from the Energy and Commerce Committee. And the chairs of the committees asked us to come in and explain the plan. And Tom and I sat at a table, and directly across from us were Dan Rostenkowski, the chair of the Ways and Means Committee, John Dingell, the chair of the Energy and Commerce Committee, and Jack Brooks, the chair of the Government Operations Committee, where we'd also recommended some changes. These were three unhappy campers and three of the most fearsome people you did not want to cross along the way. And we had a very difficult hour with them where it was made clear that anything that we wanted was not going to happen. It didn't alter the friendships we had with them, but I can guarantee you that our heart rates went up significantly during that time.
That's a wonderful story. Actually facing one of these oversight champions, not to mention three of them. Kate, if you could give us your favorite.
Yes, well, as someone who loves congressional oversight and investigations, it was hard to narrow it down to one. I have selected as my favorite the 1975 Senate investigation of the national intelligence community, though a close runner-up was the Truman Committee, and I'm sure we'll have a chance to talk about that a little later. This particular investigation was known as the Church Committee, named after its chairman, Frank Church, a Democrat of Idaho. After a series of revelations in national newspapers, but also importantly, some earlier congressional inquiries in the Senate that alleged national intelligence and law enforcement agencies had been spying on Americans who were simply exercising their constitutional right to petition their government, the Senate created this special committee to investigate those allegations. And their 15-month-long investigation revealed abuses of power by the CIA, the FBI, and various other lesser-known intelligence agencies like the NSA, for example. There was a laundry list of abuses that the committee compiled. Those abuses included assassination plots of foreign leaders, wiretapping phones and intercepting telegrams of American citizens, spying on union leaders, feminists, anti-war activists, and even members of Congress. But perhaps the most disturbing revelations included the FBI's decade-long campaign to disrupt, discredit, and weaken the civil rights movement. Church Committee investigators uncovered that the FBI had blackmailed the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. and encouraged him to commit suicide. Abuses like these were carefully documented over the course of months of public hearings and many depositions taken in depositions and witnesses who were questioned in executive hearings. They produced a multi-volume report, which they published in the spring of 1976. And this truly bipartisan effort led to both statutory and internal reforms, including the creation of the Senate's first committee to provide permanent intelligence oversight, today's Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Wow, that was a wonderful summary. Thank you so much. Derek.
Thank you. Well, I have to say that if we're talking about favorites, I'm really in the same team as Kate. I mean, I love the Church Committee investigation and the companion investigation in the House led by Otis Pike. Now, the Levin Center has yet to do the abscam investigation as a portrait. That was really the first one I ever did research on, sat down and read it as a professional historian when I was in graduate school. And so because that's not there, and because Kate has taken the church committee, I'm going to go ahead and talk about the Ku Klux Klan investigation and sort of jump on the same team as Norm as well. What I like about the Klan investigation is that, oddly enough, is that it's pretty partisan. If you look at what Congress is attempting to do at this moment, and I'm really talking about the Republican majority in Congress, is that they are not so much trying to figure out what's going on so that they can pass corrective legislation. Because if you look at when the committee starts, and I'm talking about the Senate committee as well as the joint committee that then investigates the same thing after, the Republicans in Congress are already passing the Ku Klux Klan Acts, also known as the force bills, as the committee is doing its work. In fact, before the second report comes out, they've already passed 3 different Ku Klux Klan Acts. Also, the Grant administration has already asked the Attorney General to begin investigating and seriously cracking down on the Ku Klux Klan across the South. And so what you see is not so much an effort to figure out what's going on so that it can be addressed through legislation. What you see is an effort on the part of Republicans in Congress to try and prove to a skeptical public that, in fact, what they're doing is justified. They're trying to prove that the Ku Klux Klan actually exists. Because if you look at the public reactions to the Ku Klux Klan in the South, among Democrats, white Democrats, it's primarily to say that it doesn't exist. This is just a bunch of superstitious African Americans being scared about, rumors of Confederate ghosts and things like that. In the North, the Ku Klux Klan is sort of a joke. You can actually find cartoons about it in Northern newspapers, sort of making fun of African American superstitions in the same way, or believing elite Southern whites that in fact it simply doesn't exist. And at the same time, bodies are stacking up across the South. I mean, the murder and the harassment rate among Southern Republicans, Black and white, is astronomical. And so Congress is trying to prove to a skeptical public that in fact, what it's doing to crack down on the Klan is justified. And they're doing some pretty harsh things like suspending habeas corpus in entire counties. And so it's no small thing. And by and large, they fail in that endeavor, which is what's remarkable about the investigation as well. Look, they put together a remarkable record, but if you look at the public reception of books about the Ku Klux Klan during the time, or the rationale for the rise of the Klan, what you see is that by and large, folks embrace the white Southern Democratic justification for the Klan's existence if they're even willing to admit that it exists. And so in 1874, a New York Republican, New York Tribune reporter goes down to South Carolina. His name is Pike. And he comes back and writes all these reports about how Reconstruction is a horrible mistake. African Americans are just above the level of beasts. And any effort to overthrow the Republican governments in the South is justified. That book was called The Prostrate State. And it really stands as one of the definitive books about Reconstruction governments in the 1870s. If you look at the Reconstruction jurist Albion Tourgy, who writes about his time in North Carolina battling the Klan in the late 1860s. He puts out a book called The Invisible Empire, which uses the Congressional report as his evidence base because people didn't believe him when he was talking about it in a semi-autobiographical book put out the year before in 1879. And his book is largely ignored in huge circles across the United States, particularly in the academy among historians, for God's sake. And so you can make the case that, in many ways, that effort to change public opinion about the Klan fails. And the last thing I'll say is that, and again, this is a historian in me, what I love about this investigation is that it shows these deep divisions in Congress. The majority report, both of them, is all the Republicans vote for it. The minority reports, which effectively say the Klan doesn't exist, and if it does exist, it's totally harmless. All of the Democrats on the committees vote for it. And so you have this very significant partisan divide in the reports. And I think all of that is just wonderful for a historian to understand. Unfortunately, it didn't have the impact at the time that folks wanted.
Thank you for that amazing reaction to that portrait. Really appreciate it. Liette, let's hear from you.
My favorite portrait is the one of the Watergate investigation. The 1973 Senate investigation into the Watergate break-in of the previous year is arguably an example of one of the most effective instances of congressional oversight and investigation. After the 7 burglars were convicted in DC District Court, and after the Washington Post began identifying connections between the burglars, the White House, and President Nixon's re-election committee, the Senate established a select committee to investigate any illegal, improper, or unethical campaign activities in the 1972 presidential election in which Richard Nixon won re-election. And investigate they did. The bipartisan committee was chaired by Senator Sam Ervin of North Carolina. The vice chair was Senator Howard Baker of Tennessee, Republican. They worked for 15 months with the help of other members of the committee and also more than 120 congressional staffers. And the highlight of their work was 51 days of hearings, of which a couple of weeks were televised live to the American people. The hearings established that that presidential campaign aides had stolen or destroyed sensitive documents, that bribes had been paid to influence testimony or pleas, that various people who had testified had committed perjury, and that the Nixon campaigns, the arm of the Nixon campaign had sabotaged the campaign of one-time Democratic frontrunner, Senator Edmund Muskie of Maine. The hearings also established that the White House had a taping system in key offices, meaning that tapes created by that system could either confirm or undermine testimony being made in front of Congress and the courts. Finally, the committee's investigation established that President Nixon knew of and participated in cover-ups of many of these activities. In the end, the changes brought about, or the charges that were investigated by the committee became the basis of articles of impeachment that were passed by the House Judiciary Committee under Chair Pete Rodino. And the threat of impeachment ultimately forced President Nixon to resign. All told, 48 people, including high-level White House staff, were convicted of crimes, including burglary, obstruction of justice, and perjury. Congress passed a number of laws in the aftermath of the Watergate investigation and the presidential resignation, laws that enhanced public accountability and government integrity, including amendments to the Freedom of Information Act and various election reforms. The Watergate investigation was successful in holding power to account and in improving mechanisms to enhance transparency going forward. So that's why it is my favorite of the group.
Thank you so much for that analysis. It's good to know that the Watergate scandal still resonates all these years later. Some of you have already touched on this, but just to think about it a little bit more deeply, the role of Congress as a fact finder. Many of these portraits took place in a period of crisis in American history. We can think of the Civil War, Teapot Dome, corruption scandal, the stock market crash in 1929, the Red Scare, Watergate, collapse of Enron. What do they say to you as historians about the role of Congress as a fact finder and as a contributor to how the public perceives the American story and what actually, as a matter of fact, is going on? And I'm just going to open this up to the panel and allow anybody to give us some of their thoughts.
Let me start, Elise. And I want to start with the Truman investigation and the lead up to the Second World War and our military capabilities. I mentioned this in part, another little story. One time when I visited Carl in his office and we were just schmoozing, he pulled out all the letters that he had accumulated from Harry Truman. Harry Truman was his hero, and he had scoured the country to find these letters that Truman had signed, some of them handwritten. But he talked about Truman's rise as a major political figure, as a fairly obscure senator. And I mention this one because it is very clear that through sloth, corruption, and in other ways, the military capability that we had, as we knew that we were moving towards a time where we might end up in war, was slipshod, and that we were not well prepared. And if Congress had not gone out there with Truman going around the country and investigating the facts, it's unlikely that we would have seen the jolt in the system that got us prepared to do so, and that put us on a straight and narrow path. And that's happened repeatedly. It happens because Congress does have the ability, especially if the two parties work together, and especially if an administration doesn't interfere along the way, to be able to get facts and present them to the public that other bodies, whether it's done through private sector initiatives, which rarely work. We know, for example, from one of the investigations that the ability of letting large financial institutions to regulate their own behavior fell apart. Congress uncovered that. And if we get the Justice Department or other actors looking into criminal activities, they generally will not talk about it publicly until you actually get to a trial itself. So Congress plays a unique role here. One other thing that I'll mention that is not a part of the portraits, except a little bit tangentially, and I want to give a shout out to Henry Waxman and Tom Davis, a Democrat and a Republican, as we moved into an era of tribal and partisan divisions, but who worked together. And among other things, investigated the use of drugs in performance-enhancing drugs in sports, had sports figures like Roger Clemens come in and lie about their own activities, others who actually came clean. But it was that public focus that jolted professional sports leagues to trying to do something more to police those activities. Congress does the public inquest, and nobody else in many ways can do it in the same way.
Thank you. Other thoughts about Congress as a fact finder? Yeah.
Yeah. So Norm's remarks highlight the importance of this fact-finding role and mission in real time, in current events, as events happen. But of course, historians value congressional investigations because they produce a historical record. They get testimony, they amass records. So it makes it possible to look at what happened, not only at the present time, but also from a view further out, and also to try to draw and look for continuities and changes over time. So in real time, but also as a matter of establishing a historical record.
Other thoughts? Well, one important investigation going on right now is looking at the January 6th attack on the US Capitol. Do any of the portraits speak to you about that current congressional oversight effort? Again, it's open to the panelists.
Well,
I'll start. Go ahead.
Well, I certainly, the KKK investigation speaks to, I think, January 6th. I mean, look, history rhymes, it doesn't repeat itself. But I think there's no question that you have really a tremendously intense partisan split on an issue, not simply of the potential policy fix, but the basic facts of a case. And so you see, just like with the KKK investigation, the parties lining up on either side of whether or not this investigation will even happen when it comes to January of 6. You have members of Congress openly defying the requests of the committee today. And so you see a very similar circumstance there. And of course, I think in both instances, and this is really the part that quite frankly frightens me, that you see the very nature of American democracy in the balance. We have to admit, on the back end of the KKK investigation, that democracy died in the American South for a solid 100 years. It simply was not a democratic part of the country. You did not have majority rule in the vast majority of the American South for a solid 100-year period after the KKK investigations. And it's because the people who were part of the minority report for those investigations effectively created a Herrenvolk democracy, one in which only white Americans had access to the levers of power. And quite frankly, if you look at the legislation that came after that investigation, it was really specific types of white people, rich white people, and rich white men who had access to levers of democracy. I pray that this time around we don't have a similar result, but certainly the stakes are in the same area.
I would second that, but I would also add analogies in a different way to the Watergate investigation. Watergate investigation started out in a fairly partisan way. Republicans did not really want to take this down the path that it went. We know that when Howard Baker made his famous statement, what we need to find out here is, what did the president know and when did he know it? His expectation was that if it was framed that way, it would exonerate Nixon. But what we know is that as they moved along, most of the members of the Senate panel saw facts emerging and took it to the logical conclusion. Howard Baker is one of the great heroes in my mind of the 20th century Senate in a whole host of ways. We can't forget that he basically sacrificed his own presidential ambitions to get a Panama Canal Treaty because it was the right thing for the country to do. And he acted in that way as we moved through that investigation in Watergate. So did Fred Thompson, who of course later became a senator who did a lot of his own oversight. But as I look at today, there's no Howard Baker. If there is a Howard Baker there, it is Liz Cheney. But Howard Baker was a central, respected figure in the center of his own party, and there is a massive effort to discredit Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger in their party. There is no Hugh Scott. Mitch McConnell has said some things that indicates that he wasn't happy with what happened on January 6th. But remember that Mitch McConnell led his party to filibuster and kill a bipartisan commission to look into the events of January 6th. There is no John Rhodes, the very partisan Republican leader of the House, who also wanted to see the integrity of the process carried out and was one of the people who went to the White House to tell Nixon that he had to resign before being impeached and convicted. Kevin McCarthy is the exact opposite of what we saw with John Rhodes. And we don't have very many who fit the profile of other Republicans in the House and Senate in 1973 and 74 who followed the facts and let them guide the behavior. This is a different world now, even than the highly partisan one we lived in through that time. And it's a very, very worrisome, to say the least, development in our politics and governance.
Would anyone else like to comment? Well, Norm was just talking about particular members of Congress, and many of the portraits focus on individual members of Congress and the role they played in specific investigations. You know, we can think about oversight as a set of rules and procedures and norms, but how useful is it to think about oversight in terms of the individual members of Congress? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, let me jump in there real quick. As you probably know, Elise, at the end of Senator Levin's Senate career, I did more than 20 oral history interviews with him about his legacy and all of his work as a public figure. And we spent a lot of time talking about oversight and the legacy that he had, but also sort of what he thought made someone a good, what member of Congress, what were the qualities for a member of Congress to be effective at oversight? And I remember at the very end of his career, there was a fabulous article published saying that corporate America won't miss Senator Levin, but the American public will, because he did so much fabulous oversight work. And I asked him, I thought that, I know that that article brought him a lot of pleasure, but I asked him if he thought there were members who could take over the reins as he was upon his retirement. And he mentioned a few names, but he talked specifically about the kind of qualities that he thought made someone an effective oversight or investigatory specialist. And he said it really boiled down to being willing to take on sacred cows, that you would have to be willing to go after powerful interests and stick with it and follow the story and follow the facts wherever they took you. And I also recall that he said how much time he spent with you and other members of his staff studying the issues and really wanting to get the facts straight before you would go to your public hearings and try to tell this narrative story to inform the American public and other members of Congress about what the particular issue was that needed to be addressed. So I think that these portraits are useful. I think these individual portraits are useful because I do think it takes a certain type of lawmaker to commit to effective oversight. And so I look forward to that Carl Levin portrait that I know is coming.
Well, I'll just offer the thought that we obviously think, we're the Levin Center, that he had a legacy of bipartisan fact-based oversight that is worth pursuing. And we did include portraits of other members of Congress who also had that thought. Senator Levin, one of his most important things, messages that he gave to his staff is, you need to do investigations with people who have a fundamentally different worldview than your own. If you investigate with people who agree with you, you don't challenge each other, you miss a lot of facts. It's only when you investigate with people who have a different worldview that you look at more issues, you look at more facts, you challenge each other, and the end result is more accurate, more thoughtful, more thorough, and certainly more credible. And that's a message I think that is important today for members of Congress. There are actually, I think, a number of fantastic members right now who are doing oversight, or portraits tend to be in the past, not what's going on right now. But I do think it's useful to take that individual perspective. We had a question that came in from the audience, and I'd just like to pose it to you. This came from Lorna Grenadier, and she asked, how important is acceptance of the rule of law to what oversight hearings can accomplish? Is public opinion a factor in their success or in their impact? And I'm wondering if you have some thoughts as historians about those two issues, the rule of law and the role of public opinion.
I'll jump in and say that as a historian, one of the things that I've really enjoyed in exploring these different historic investigations is to dig into the constituent correspondence that comes into the chairman's office. The National Archives has lots of tens of thousands of letters of constituent correspondence to people responding in real time to these investigations. I'm thinking the Truman investigation has a fabulous collection of materials as people are sort of seeing themselves as citizen whistleblowers and responding to Truman's call to let them know what's going on in their communities with the war mobilization. And so I think that harnessing public opinion and using public hearings and committee reports to help educate the public about what the need is can really help to lead to a kind of long-term legislative resolution, statutory resolution, internal resolution, whatever that might be. In the case of Truman, it was really effective. And of course, it did help to build his national profile. But even in the case of other lesser known investigations that I've explored, it's really interesting to see how the American public is responding in real time. In the case of the Pecora investigation of Wall Street financial abuses in the 1930s, you can see the public's response to what they, in the roaring 20s, people believed that these financial titans were gods. They were amazing people who brought incredible prosperity to the country. And then with the Great Depression, and the Pecora inquiry, which sort of detailed for the American public some of the ways that these people had built their wealth and helped the American public understand why some of them had lost their own financial resources during the crash. You can see that the American public, their perception of these financial titans really changes over time. And that's largely as a result of the committee's very good and diligent work to demonstrate the ways in which these people took advantage of the system to benefit themselves at the expense of the greater public.
Let me weigh in. We've talked a lot about the Ku Klux Klan, but obviously the rule of law becomes a critical factor if you have, for example, vigilante groups out there that are defying the law. And if you have a united front and a recognition that this is wrong, you have much greater capability of rallying a public and doing something about it. When you have a division on that front, it doesn't work quite as effectively. We also know that in many of these investigations, the result was a strengthening of laws or of a regulatory capacity because the laws were inadequate to police or to deal with malfeasance or misconduct or even worse. And if you don't have a fundamental respect for the rule of law, that's what we've seen with the investigation of January 6th. And I know it's a little tricky even as we talk about the broader questions throughout history. But the fact is now that if you look at what happened at the Capitol, a violent insurrection, trashing a building that had managed to escape anything of this sort through so many previous periods of unrest, that members come back and then 2/3 of one party's members vote that the election was stolen, and undermining any attempt to get at get to the bottom of what was a violent insurrection. And then the attempts afterwards, even for a few days, we saw whether it was Leader McCarthy or Leader McConnell saying this was a horrible thing and the president bears some responsibility and we need to deal with it, moving away from that. If you have a mobilized front, it shocks the public into realizing that this is not business as usual. If you don't, it undermines Congress's ability to basically keep the legal structure and the fundamentals of the political system and the constitutional system in place.
Earlier, Derek mentioned that one of the portraits that we haven't done is of the abscam investigation. I personally have a list of about 20 more investigations that I think need to be profiled, but I'd like to ask all of you if there are oversight investigations that in particular you think we should include as we continue down this road.
Well, I can jump in there if you all don't mind, because as a DC resident and as a DC historian, I have to say that one of the more fascinating investigations that I've seen, which is an example of oversight being used for propaganda purposes in order to sort of encourage people to break the law, was in 1956, the House DC committee put together a special subcommittee to investigate, and I'm quoting, juvenile delinquency and low school standards in the DC schools. It was the brainchild of John Bell Williams, a rank segregationist from Mississippi who wasn't even on the committee. He went to John McMillan, who was another rank segregationist from South Carolina who chaired the committee and who spent the entire 20 years of his chairmanship making sure that the people of the district did not have home rule. And they put together this committee because President Eisenhower in 1954 had really pushed for swift adoption of desegregation in the DC school system to make it a model for desegregation following the Supreme Court's decision in Brown versus Board. And these segregationists, particularly John Bell Williams, who was quite literally working hand in glove with the Citizens Council out of Mississippi, wanted to find a way for Congress to put its stamp of approval on a large report effectively saying that integration had been a total failure and in fact was dangerous. And so they investigated the DC school system, which admittedly at the time was hemorrhaging white students because white DC residents were leaving the city in droves, quite literally hundreds of thousands over the course of the 1950s. But they stacked the subcommittee with segregationists. They even had one Republican segregationist, a guy by the name of Joel Broyhill from the Virginia suburbs, to give it a sort of bipartisan sheen. And they wrote up this report that was just flat out fabrication. They cherry picked witnesses. They asked them leading questions. Even some of the witnesses balked and they just shut off the conversations with them so that they wouldn't get the answers that they didn't want. And then they put everything into a very slick 48-page report, printed up thousands of copies at taxpayer expense and sent them all across the South so that advocates of segregation in the South could justify massive resistance to integration, which of course was going on around the region. And it really, did tremendous damage to the reputation of the District of Columbia and to the cause of integration. It's a remarkable episode, and it's been written up wonderfully by Jason Morgan Ward in the journal called the Journal of Human Rights, pardon me. And so I suggest that as the source.
Oversight gone wrong. I get a sense that there might be an article from you in the future on that too. I would encourage you to think about it, to update that issue. Anybody else? Yeah.
I think that there are ample occasions in which Congress did not investigate or effectively investigate the denial of voting rights that could be the subject of future portraits in history, whether it is the failure to invoke the clauses of the 14th Amendment that allow for restricting representation in Congress, or other provisions. Those are not portraits that we've seen yet and that I would love to see. For example, after the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920, African-American women in the South, many of them found that they could not vote, that they were turned away from the polls, though they expected that the amendment had included them. In 1921, there was a very brief investigation in which members of the NAACP testified to violence that had taken place in the election season of 1921 as African-American women, but also African-American men now returning from war as veterans asserted their right to vote. It was very brief, and there was never an effort, an effective effort made to try to use the powers granted by the Constitution to impose penalties. So on many occasions in which voting rights haven't been respected, there are lots of opportunities for portraits of oversight or failure to oversee that might be generated.
Well, it seems like the time is ripe for a real in-depth review of congressional oversight and voting rights. I think there have been successes and failures, as you just described, and that would be a fascinating historical perspective on congressional oversight. Norm.
Lisa, I want to mention three that I'd love to see the center do. One is Henry Waxman's investigation of the tobacco companies and what it did.
That's on my list.
As it almost inevitably would be. It's compelling. I would also like to see an investigation of the Benghazi oversight hearings, such as they were, as an example of overreach, abuse of power, and failure. And finally, as an example of mundane oversight, and it'll take me back a little bit, Bob Kastenmeier was a longtime congressman from Wisconsin who didn't get a lot of public acclaim, but was a model. He chaired the subcommittee on trademarks and patents, something that had no great public appeal, although extraordinarily important, especially in this modern day and age, as we see China and others abusing patents and trademarks, theft of them, and so on. And he devoted a good part of his career to working in this area in ways that had no benefit to him back home in Madison, Wisconsin, but which really created a framework for something that's truly important for the global economy and America's role in it. And doing examples like that, where there's little credit given to people because there's no public attention paid, but it's doing the work that Congress should be doing. There are several of those, and that's one.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. We included one portrait like that with Ribicoff and traffic safety to show that how he spent an enormous effort to try to get that issue addressed, and in doing so saved literally millions of lives. So it's an investigation that has been largely forgotten, despite Ralph Nader's role in it and how we found out that GM actually had him followed, and that then led to a increased interest in his book, so it got a lot more attention. But there are a lot of congressional investigations that have not gotten a lot of attention and yet had a very important impact on the United States. And the Kastenmeier one is very interesting. I hadn't heard of that before, so that's very cool. I have to add that to my list. Kate, do you have any suggestions for us?
Well, I have a couple. One is actually more about things that don't become sort of national inquiries, or don't have a big splash, or maybe don't get investigated, but it'd be interesting to see why. Like climate change, there were a couple of fabulous sort of basic oversight issues in the late 80s, and then things didn't really go anywhere. So I don't know if you have plans to tackle those things that don't become.
I think we need an academic to take us down that path of congressional oversight on environmental issues.
Yes, yes. Another one that I'm thinking of is are just some of the campaign finance investigations of the early 20th century. There are a couple of investigating the presidential elections of 1908 and 1912. I think you'll find some really fascinating sort of forgotten characters there, but
in 1987 as well. That was
really,
what Senator Levin did.
Yes, people who are really trying to make a difference and get a handle on a huge topic, and one, of course, that has a lot of significance for us today and is still something we're talking about. So why did those earlier efforts not, what were the results of those earlier efforts? And if they weren't as producing strong sort of some strong statutory requirements, why not? That would be really interesting.
I hope all of the historians that are watching this realize what a tremendous field of academic research is available in the oversight field. We've been trying at the Levin Center very hard to get oversight recognized as an academic field, and you can just see from this conversation how many things could still be addressed. Well, I'd like to turn now to sort of a final lightning round of allowing everyone to take just a couple minutes and provide us with some concluding thoughts about the portraits in oversight, both what we've been able to do so far, what we need to do in the future, and just any other thoughts you have about this topic. And I think what I'd like to do is go in reverse order this time and start off with Liette and give us any concluding thoughts you might have.
I think that much of what we've said today needs to be put into relationship with the January 6th investigation that is ongoing at this moment. Perhaps at a far future date, there will be a portrait in oversight of people who are involved in those investigations right now, whether it is the chair of the committee now or Republican members of the committee now. The stakes of oversight could not be higher, and the current investigation shows this, right? Because there are few things more fundamental to the democratic project, the American democratic project, than the transfer of power, in particular between opposing parties. And so I'm interested in seeing oversight be as successful as possible. And I think that all of the things that we've said about oversight today apply in some way to the current January 6th investigation.
Derek, your thoughts?
Well, I've been pretty negative, so I'm gonna pivot to the really positive moments of oversight, and I'll say that I think that what they show is that there's really two things that we need in our members of Congress. The first is a willingness to do the hard work of being an elected official, looking at the mundane things that aren't going to give you a really great thing to talk about on Twitter or get you on the 24-hour news services. That is just part of being a responsible member of government. I'm thinking about like Elijah Cummings' focus on Coast Guard acquisitions in the wonderful portrait on Elijah Cummings that you have on the website. And then the other thing I think is that, you know, what those good portraits also show us is the desperate need for statesmen in our Congress. And I'm certainly not arguing that there are none there today. I think there are. You know, my neighbor, Jamie Raskin from up the street in Montgomery County comes to mind immediately. But these are people who are willing to say, you know, to sacrifice themselves and to sacrifice sometimes the interests of their party for the greater good, for the good of the country. And so when I look at those you know, those portraits and courage that you have among some of the portraits, I want to see those two things in a larger number of our members of Congress today.
Kate, your thoughts?
Yes, I think that the portraits that you have produced really demonstrate the ways that congressional oversight has made a difference historically in the lives of people across the nation and at times even people around the world. And that can be both, that difference can be both positive and negative. So I don't want to be only positive in my portrayal of congressional investigations. But I think that the common threads in these portraits are that the best of them are bipartisan efforts to document a problem, to explain that problem to the American public and other members of Congress, in order to find a common solution to what can typically be very complex problems. I think too that as the size of the federal government has grown and as the nation has become more complex, the need for ongoing congressional oversight and investigation has only grown with it. So I hope to see, as Liette and Derek have mentioned before me, I hope to see people in Congress taking this very seriously and seeing this as a part of their public service.
Thank you. Norm, your thoughts?
So as you pull these portraits together, I hope at some point it will be a time to step back and draw larger lessons. One of those lessons, or one of the questions that I hope we can address, is how do we reinstill institutional patriotism in both the House and the Senate? I saw that one of the participants earlier was Sean Theriot, who is a political scientist who wrote a book called The Gingrich Senators, about so many members of the class of 1994, excuse me, or a couple of classes earlier, who moved from the House to the Senate. Their orientation was not, I'm a part of a great institution. It was, how can we use these institutions for partisan gain and partisan purposes? And we've seen, I think, an erosion. It's asymmetric, but it's there in both parties, where the larger concern is not a part of being in an institution and making sure that you fulfill the responsibilities of that institution working together. A second is, how can we, and this is something we've grappled with, I know I've grappled with over many decades as we've gone through multiple iterations of larger congressional reform, how can we build in incentives to do oversight? And there I mean not the investigation of scandals or problems, but the day-to-day grind of looking to make sure that the laws are being faithfully executed, that we're adequately funding programs, that we're doing the right thing by the American people. And, you know, a part of the earlier committee recommendations or committee reform recommendations was if we only create oversight subcommittees on committees. Well, that's worked with some of the big ones, the Committee on Oversight and Investigations in the Senate that Carl dealt with so effectively, the one in the House that John Dingell did so effectively. But what we found is that oversight subcommittees on many of the committees didn't do that job because there were no political incentives. Can we find a better way of making this happen? And finally, I would say we just have to grapple with the larger reality. We're in an age of tribalism. We're in an age where working together, even finding a common core of problems, has eroded so badly that oversight used as a political bludgeon has become more the order of the day than doing what we would hope Congress would do. And maybe we can get something back if we see at the appropriate time a bipartisan look back at all the responses to COVID from the beginning, through what were missteps and often appropriate things to do, both through the Trump administration and in the Biden administration. Look at what the roles of the CDC and the FDA and the NIH and other agencies should be in dealing with these sets of issues. And one more, where we've seen a little bit, but we need more, is the problems at the border and child separation. We need to dig much more deeply into pathologies in the Department of Homeland Security that continue to this present day, and how it would be possible that families could be separated and that there would be no way of reconnecting them or contacting them. That is a tragedy of immense human proportions. Congress has to clean house.
Well, I want to thank our panelists for this wonderful discussion about the importance of oversight and the role that it can play in the country. I think too many legislators forget about their oversight responsibilities or don't understand it. And yet, in a time where it's very, very difficult to enact legislation, oversight becomes an alternative that can provide a lot of satisfaction. And if you're willing to do it, if you can find a partner and you can do it in a bipartisan way, you can come up with results that are not only accurate and thoughtful, but can be credible and also lay a foundation for reforms. I think I want to thank all of our viewers, and I want to encourage the academic community that we need your insights. We need your research. We need your understanding so that we can appreciate the importance of oversight, understand how it can be done well, and how it can contribute to the American story. And not only the American story, but because, to be honest, I think the Congress has set an example for the world about how a legislature can do oversight and find facts. It's possible to find facts even in the world today and lay a foundation for reforms. I'd also like to point out that while we've been talking about Congress this whole time, the Levin Center is also looking at the legislatures in the 50 states and how they also do oversight and can contribute to the American story and to leading to a more perfect union, as persons wiser than me have pointed out. So I'd like to thank you again, and I'd like to turn this over to Jim for a few concluding remarks.
Well, thank you, Elise. Let me just close by thanking our panelists for their lively and insightful remarks. Again, thank you, Elise, for your excellent questions. And I'll just repeat it again. We would love our panelists, as well as academics in the audience and others who maybe are not in the audience, to consider applying for a Levin Center Oversight Fellows Program. I also want to thank the U.S. Capitol Historical Society for co-sponsoring this event. As Derek pointed out, Paul Waldman published that column yesterday in the Washington Post decrying the behavior of some senators in their questioning of Dr. Anthony Fauci. And the quote that stuck with me was, he said, "We get the oversight we elect." But that does not mean that we have to sit idly by while legislators misuse the power of oversight, or while the executive branch or others that hold a public trust refuse to comply with necessary and proper legislative requests for information. We don't have to accept it when the media chooses to ignore the work and findings of important oversight efforts and instead focus on shouting matches and misinformation that too often echo in our legislative hearing rooms. So ultimately, we do get the oversight we elect, but today's panelists, and we hope our portrait series, remind us of the way that oversight investigations have influenced history and informed our understanding of the American story. I hope that by highlighting the good, the bad, and the ugly of oversight, we can recognize its importance and begin to hold accountable our elected representatives for how well they discharge this vitally important duty. Please note, lastly, that a recording of this discussion will be available on our website, and we encourage you to let others know that if they miss this event, they can check it out at their leisure on our website. And with that, I'll thank you all and look forward to seeing you again, hopefully in person in the future. Have a good afternoon.